Today on Books du Jour, my guests are Joshua Henkin for A World Without You, Ayana Mathis for the 12 Tribes of Hattie, and Shteyngart, Little Failure, a Memoir. The reason for you to write is to manifest what? What aspect of yourself? You feel like,
Everyone's staring at each other.
That's right. It's a big question because
I'm just an angry guy who has nothing better to do, you know. So
could you do something else?
No other skills.
I failed at every other thing I've ever attempted. I tried to be a paralegal.
Can't do anything else.
I tried to work as a janitor at my father's nuclear power plant. Couldn't do that well. So it's this. This is the last resort, I think, for people.
For you, at least.
For me, at least. Yes.
But
This is starvation.
You, I think, from your memoir, your first novel was about Lenin, correct?
Yeah, when I was growing up in Leningrad, there was a big
yeah.
statue of Lenin, the biggest statue of Lenin in Leningrad, and I loved Lenin so much. Every morning I'd hug his pedestal. And my grandmother, who was a journalist for Leningrad, Evening Leningrad Pravda, asked me to write a book when I was 5 years old. She said, you should be a novelist. Can you write a book for me? I'll pay you 3 slices of cheese for each page. And that's what I did. So I wrote a book called Lenin and His Magical Goose, and it was about Lenin meeting a magical goose and invading Finland and starting a socialist revolution there in Finland. And then Lenin finds out that the goose is Menshevik, Lenin is Bolshevik, so he kills and eats the goose.
So it was like Animal Farm before the time, right?
Yes, it was Animal Farm with geese instead of pigs.
It's always interesting. I always think about people who have been uprooted from their roots, I suppose, obviously. You remind me a lot of your style of writing. You have a strong Gogolian element, you know. So I think, like, you know, you can take the man out of the country, but you can, it's a very Russian characteristic. Too self-deprecating and the mocking, the buying you dead souls and there, you know.
Well, satire is possible when
Yeah.
evil and stupidity collide, and that's
right,
been
yeah.
Russian history for the last
right.
millennia. So it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. People often tell you that your style of writing remind them of that trend.
Yes, and that's the biggest compliment I can have, I think.
Oh, so we're done now. Thank you.
So thank you.
Ayana, your journey to writing has been, what has it been?
Fairly slow. I mean, we've been writing since I was a kid.
Did you write a novel by 6 years old?
No, I didn't. I did write a collection of short stories by 9.
Well, a collection, damn.
You're next.
You got to think of a good
I mean, it was really silly. They were all these short stories. I don't know why I was a really morose and sad child, but I had written this teenager. I was obsessed with teenagers, and there was this girl named Blue, and she lived in a treehouse. And it was very strange. She was really sad, and she never kind of came down. She didn't have a bathroom up there. I don't know what happened to her family. It was all very strange. But I always joked that that's the last fiction I wrote until I was 35. And
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I wrote during that time, but mostly I was writing poetry for quite a long time.
And yet the theme is still there in Hattie's book. Do you have the compulsion to have to write every day? And you feel like your brain starts sizzling a little bit?
No, the smoke starts coming out of my ears or something. No, I don't. I kind of wish that I did. I'd say I could go for ages without writing anything, and I'm fine. Although, I guess probably my partner would disagree, because I do think that I become, with no outlet for my various, wild imaginings and frustrations and miseries, I think they start to actually come out of my mouth. So that's probably not that. She would probably have a different story. I would say I could go for ages. She would say not so much.
Not so much. Joshua, your journey to writing has been as precocious as
No, I wasn't publishing collections of stories when I was 9 years old.
You should be writing your memoir, The Failure.
Yeah, so I always wanted to be a writer, but I thought that wasn't realistic. And I went off to college, determined to take a more traditional path, a conservative path. But I moved out to Berkeley after college for what I thought would be a year, and I was working in a magazine, and one of the things I was doing was I was the first reader of fiction manuscripts. And I saw how many terrible ones there were, and I felt oddly inspired. I thought, if other people were willing to try and risk failure, then I should be willing to try and risk failure. Every day you sit down to write, you're always risking failure, and the fraud police is hanging over you. I mean,
you believe that? You don't believe, like, after a while you have your confidence settled in and you start
No, I don't think so. Because I don't know if you guys feel this, but like if you ever have to look back at a book you wrote, I mean, first of all, it's embarrassing, and you don't remember having written it, and you're only focused on what you're working on right now. I mean, we're probably all at a stage where nothing we write is so bad that it can't pass freshman comp, but is it going to be magical?
Isn't that a journey of life? You start in one place and then you get older and wiser and you end up somewhere else. And when you look back, you feel like, oh my God, I can't believe I did this.
What about all those novelists whose first novels were amazing and then never were able to do anything again?
Because maybe it was just a lucky straw. I don't know.
That's what we're all afraid of.
That's what everybody's scared of.
It's going to catch up with you. I'm almost thinking of outsourcing my books to India because I go to India, I meet these wonderful writers. I think, please just do this for me. I'll pay you 800 rupees, just write the rest of this book.
But your story actually is interesting because you told me when the first time we met that it was a collection of short stories you were planning to do, right? So you were starting to do small pieces.
Exactly, yeah. Well, it wasn't, I didn't even think that it was going to be a collection of anything. Okay. It was just some short stories.
Some short stories.
And then, you know, that sort of presented itself as the structure of the novel once I realized it was a novel. But I don't, with this one, and I suspect also with I suppose your process can change, you know, as you go. You all would know better than I would as you sort of move forward. But my tendency tends to be to just know a few very key things going in. Because I know for some people it works really well to outline, and I suppose if you were writing, you know, a 900-page novel, then you would need to. But I find that if I know too much about what's going to happen or the people, that my imagination freezes. And it starts to feel like I'm kind of painting by numbers. Like I'm filling in, you know, some nice sentences to some kind of skeleton that already exists. And it's really flat and I freeze and it's unnatural. So I can't know too much, which is also kind of awful because then you sort of feel like you're banging your head around in a really horrible dark room. But it's the only way that I can sort of produce anything, I think.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, I think one of the hard things is it takes a couple of years not to know whether the novel is going to be any good, but whether it's going to be a novel at all. And I kind of feel like, you know, if you map your stuff out, at least for me, I feel like you get what a friend of mine called Lipton Cuppa story, where you're injecting your characters into a preordained plot. Yeah. You know, a friend of mine in college wrote her psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And the adults group the apple with the banana, and kids group the monkey with the banana. And that's what I think fiction writers are, is they're monkey banana people. And I think to be a monkey banana person, you've got to like let your characters take you where they take you. So
yeah, that's it.
I don't know, I just think it's very hard to map things out, and you really have to cede control. And we're all control freaks at heart, and that's the hard part. So.
But that's the beautiful thing, because you start out, I love plot, and I love plot-driven books, and you know, in one book I had like a 78 plot points spreadsheet, if you will, and part accountant, part writer. Yeah. But then after a while, if it works, the characters say, "Screw you, creator! I'm much better than you think I am," and they take over. And then by the end, you know, like 7 of those plot points survived, and the rest were just my characters wouldn't have it.
They're just notes.
They're just notes in the end, and you discard them. And that's a great feeling when your characters stand up and start acting for themselves.
And they plot for you.
They plot for you. Yeah, and you begin to talk to them and dream about them. And when I don't know if you guys ever had it, but I've had characters show up in dreams and lecture me about things, and I think that's either a sign of psychosis or things are really working.
Yeah, I mean, my last book took me 5 years to write, and I threw out 2,000 pages. The previous book took me 3 years to write, 10 years to write, and I threw out 3,000 pages. Really? So, you know, I'm making slow progress. Wow. But I think that throwing out pages is the way to go, and you have to make a lot of mistakes along the way. I mean, Michael Cunningham talks about how he thinks that the most minor character in your novel has to be thought of as a major character in another novel was making a cameo appearance in your book. And so I think if you throw out lots of pages, those are, the bad days are investments in good days. And so, I mean, that's how it comes about in some ways. So.
I started writing because I wanted my grandmother to love me, then I wanted the kids in Hebrew school to love me. I just wanted love. You know, that's pathetic. That's a pathetic reason to write. But it's there.
Not actually.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, it's sort of pathetic.
Mean Frenchman. I think it's lovely.
But now, you know, instead of putting out a book every 4 years, I can post a picture of my dachshund and get all this love. And that substitutes for writing.
Immediate gratification.
Immediate gratification from adorable people all over the country.
And from your dachshund.
And from my dachshund. He looks at the, it's true love.
It's mutual love. Yeah.
It's mutual.
I tend to feel when I go to this Twitter and read people's Facebook posting, we sort of manufacture a version of ourselves which is not quite true.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think if there's identity issues, we want to show this is me, this is what I'm doing. Look at me, you know, and talk about narcissism, whatever it's a culture of sleeper narcissists. Do you encounter that as well, like when you read your friends' posts on Facebook or
For
Twitter?
sure. You know, I have a friend who went off of, people go on these sort of Facebook diets, you know, and I had a friend who was, her novel is probably going to come out in about a year. And so she was just having, you know, sort of crises every day about it, and it was in edits, and she was having, you know, various heart attacks and fits. And so she went on Facebook because she just kind of couldn't deal with everybody's baby and everybody's trip to Hong Kong and everybody's, you know,
wonderful life.
And everyone's fabulous edited life, you know. And we really are narrative creatures. And we're also, I mean, we're also self-obsessed creatures, of course, you know.
Yes.
But we're also really narrative creatures, and so you want to make the, you know, we've sort of been presented with this thing where you can make these visual pictures, which is accessible to everybody, so you don't have to sit around at your desk being miserable and wanting to kill yourself for years on end, you know, with trying to write something. Do you know what I mean? You can go out and you can take pictures and you can create a narrative about yourself and about your life.
I think people are, I mean, I think that's what we're doing when we read fiction.
Yeah,
I mean, we're, you know, I mean, when I first started to write fiction, I couldn't write a paragraph without showing it to every one of my friends, you know, their poor souls. But, you know, now I never want to show my work until, you know, the very, very end. And I think that we're, you know, we're doing the same thing people are doing on Facebook. We're trying to make, you know, order out of chaos in some sort of way. So.
Exactly, but I would love to see a social media that actually deals with life as it is. So instead of I'm rappelling down Mount Kilimanjaro, it's, you know, my husband and I are fighting because I got, you know, orange juice with too much pulp and not enough pulp. You know, these mundane Raymond Carverian details of life that's really life, and not these edited, highly glossed pictures of beautiful babies in, you know, in Saint-Tropez or whatever.
You brought a good point about when you start writing fiction. I think the word fiction implies it's not real. You know, when we show a side of reality, which is fictionalized, or I think it's got to be a symptom of a bigger malaise in the society. You know, do you find that in other people that you write? Do you find that also there's distortion happening?
When I teach my students, I always think their stories are incredibly revealing, not because they're autobiographical, but because it tells us about their fantasies.
Their fantasies.
And so, in some ways, I think in a weird way, fiction is more revealing of the writer than the truth, because the truth is just the truth.
Well, the projections.
Right.
I mean,
whereas fiction, it's like, I think we're all revealing ourselves in ways that we can't possibly know and understand, and that's probably why we're so afraid. Is because, you know, we are much more naked than we realize.
No, I agree completely with the fantasy and autobiographical aspects. When I was writing my first book, it was me, but actually meeting young women who liked me, which was not the case in real life. So, you know, going back to the memoir, it was this, but I had to write the truth. It was me as I really was, without the love. And that's harder to write, but the other part is very revealing too, because you're revealing what you want. You're revealing what you actually desire from life.
What you want, what you fear, I mean, all your fantasies are
what
right on
you
the
fear,
page.
the fear of success, failure, the whole 9 yards.
I've read your book, and actually I hear you on an interview, and I read about that, and I was like, oh, it's interesting. You can really not take a stance against or for, and just leave it out there and people to decide. I don't know if it's utterly possible to remove yourself from the process without putting your stamp on it.
I always feel as a reader that if I feel like the writer is preaching at me and doesn't treat me as intelligent enough to make up my own mind, then I feel like the deck is stacked. I mean, I can't remember who, it might have been V.S. Naipaul who said that a great novel can cause a revolution, but if the novelist is trying to cause a revolution, it'll never do that. And so you always have to write from inside your character.
James Baldwin wrote about the present, and his novel, you wrote about the past and make a story and you show people in tremendous predicaments and struggling through that. So there's an attempt to narrate the past and the history of it.
Certainly.
Yes. You've seen the films like The Butler or 12 Years a Slave. They come to the sort of same trend. You know, it almost feel like at the moment maybe we come a long way from slavery days where now we can look at it, and I know it's a role of the Afro-American culture, the black culture, just to create this past or put some roots somewhere, create an identity that I haven't had where now it's acceptable to do it.
My intention always, and my priority, and what I felt was my responsibility when I was writing the novel, was to inhabit and present Hattie as a character as clearly as I possibly could.
It's very troublesome when you have to represent a community.
Good Lord, you know?
Yeah, good Lord. When I was writing my first book, I felt like there weren't Russian-American novels for my generation of Russian Americans. I was scared to death. It took me 5 years to even approach anyone with the book because I kept thinking, this is dirty laundry, nobody's gonna, my parents are gonna kill me, which they did. I teach a lot of students who are immigrants, and they'll come to me and they'll say, my mom read my story and she said, no, that's not how it was in Thailand at all. It was a whole different. And I said, but this is what you know. This is how you experienced it, and that's what matters. That's why these characters come alive. That's why you're writing good work. You can't, don't show this to your mother, whatever you do. The world that you depict doesn't really exist outside of your own imagination. It exists partly, but it's your world, and that's what matters, and it's your voice.
How are you perceived by the Russian Jewish community? How they welcome your writing? They're making fun of them, or the culture?
So far, Russian Jews, especially in my generation, have been very nice. Russian Jews.
They're all, yeah.
In Russia, I'm considered to be horrible, because one headline when I visited last time was "Balding Traitor Betrays Motherland."
Oh, wow.
So. But those are good headlines to get because it shows that
You are curious.
But we're fiction writers writing about the particular, and if you want to write about the general, then you should be a politician or a speechwriter or a sociologist, all of which are good things to do, and actually they pay better than what we do. But it's not what we do. I mean, we're not representing communities. We are just representing our particular characters.
So let's talk about the Frankel family. It's your book, and it's a family that comes together 3 days over 4th of July, and there's a dead son in the background who creates pretty much is a catalyst for the family implosion. Where does that come from, the idea?
I had a cousin who died of Hodgkin's disease when he was in his late 20s, and I was only a toddler at the time. So I didn't really know him, but his death hung over the extended family for years. And then 30 years later at a family reunion, my aunt, his mother, got up and said, I have 2 sons, and we were all quite struck by this because she'd once had 2 sons, but her older son had died. And that was actually her point, that 30 years after the fact, that remained the singular seminal event in her life, and she couldn't say anything about herself without starting with that. Meanwhile, my cousin's wife eventually moved on, got remarried, had a child, and relations between her and my aunt, between her and her ex-mother-in-law, were incredibly difficult until the day my aunt died, and it got me thinking, and I've been fortunate to have neither of these things happen to me. But my sense is that if you lose a partner, if you lose a spouse, especially if you're relatively young, as awful as that must be, most people try to pick up the pieces and move on, whereas if you lose a child, I think it's harder to do that. And so the inspiration for the book was that gap between what it's like to lose a partner and what it's like to lose a child. And then I started writing about these 3 sisters who I didn't even know existed, and the book went in a direction I hadn't divined. So I think that's true for all of us. You start with a germ of something.
You start with a germ of something.
And then that germ carries you, and you have to let that germ carry you far afield. If you force the book back, then you're in trouble.
Well, Hattie, where does she come from? Is it some remnant of you, or you see talking about your fallen childhood?
So, I think I'm just really interested in the notion of matriarchy and what it does and how it functions, and interested in the ways in which we sort of tend to kind of revere it. And in some ways it deserves to be revered, and in other ways in which that is just, that it can be incredibly destructive and dysfunctional and the ways I think also in which sort of the ordinary person is.
I was in DC about a couple of months ago, and I ended up talking to this man. He had a very controversial statement, and I kept thinking about civil rights, whether the civil rights movement at the end of the day, was a good thing for the black community.
That seems to me to be a very particular kind of nostalgia, like when people are sort of like, I remember the 50s and there was Eisenhower and everybody had a Packard and we all went to baseball games together and it was all really gorgeous. And I don't know. I don't think that's actually true. I think that to some extent, maybe a little bit, but I think that you have to also look at many other factors. So I think it's easy to kind of, and it certainly is true, there were kind of cohesive, quote unquote, communities that existed, and the teacher was black and the guy at the corner was and everything. But I don't think it's completely true, and I think that if you were to look at the reasons why things are the way they are now, that you could find lots of reasons that were not about the civil rights. And certainly, I wouldn't be sitting here if there were no civil rights movement.
Sure.
So in my book, it's great, But and I think that's the case for many people, And,
Many people, and I think I absolutely agree. I mean, you talk to any Russian who's over 60 years old, and they'll say, the Stalin years were amazing. I mean, you know, half my family was killed, but the sausages were 5 kopecks a sausage, and life was wonderful. There was great support for the arts, you know. So people have this wonderful sort of imagination of the past, and we set them straight because the truth is much more complex. And
I always think that nostalgia is the strongest emotion out there. I mean, look at the Bible. I mean, the Garden of Eden. That is the, you know, the mother of all nostalgia stories.
right,
you know?
the return to Garden of Eden or Santa Monica.
Why do you think writers don't want to talk about writing? Oh, with other writers.
I think it's because we do it all day long, and then people we meet ask us about writing. So I think the writers that are starting out that I meet talk about their healthcare and their premium plans, and successful writers talk about their cars, you know, which Infiniti or Audi is better. And
you say you list a Volvo. You still like your Volvo? Huh?
I'm in a Volvo, so I'm sort of halfway between successful and still talking about my healthcare premiums.
Well, let's talk about light subject. Let's talk about families. Yeah. Families seems to be a big topic in American novels. Yeah, you talk about families, Josh, you to some extent. But it seems like today's, it's all about the family.
I love that family is the light topic. It's like the heaviest, darkest topic we could possibly get to.
I hope there's a psychiatrist on staff on this show to help me deal with your question.
Gary's got to go out and get a cab after this.
A cab and go to shrink for
You
an
took the right
hour.
position. Okay.
Thanks for
I
destroying
have to pick my daughter from school, and she's going to say, well, I didn't show up because I was talking about family. So.
It seems to be an American tradition. Is it like so threatened that we have to really put some glues everywhere to make sure it's working right?
I don't think that we were consistently being beat over the head by being told that our relationships with our mothers, fathers, husbands, kids, et cetera, were supposed to kind of exist in this sort of idealized plane of perfection, which is, of course, not true, not the project of being alive or having a family. And if one takes that stuff too seriously, you sort of walk around all day feeling deeply inadequate. Our increasing obsession with family has something to do with reacting to or against that very American obsession with perfect family.
You know, when I was a writing student, our instructor said we had to write only about family over the course of the semester. And we all flipped out. And then once we started, we found that there was actually a lot to write about. And I also think that in some ways, the preoccupation with the past in fiction, you know, can draw real lifeblood from family. It's not the only way to do it, but it's certainly, it's not a great restriction to be writing about family. So there, you know, there's so many kinds of families.
Your family, how's they reacted to your books? What was like the weirdest comment they've made or completely
The weirdest comment? People who know you and who read your books. I mean, you know, half of them are the narcissists and half of them are the paranoids. You know, the narcissists think that they're in the book and are happy, and the paranoids think they're in the book and aren't happy. So, you know.
I love it.
Your father how your father reacted to your books when they first came out, the debutante and the absurdist?
Well, when the first one came out, he called me a word that's unpronounceable on the family show, but refers to some genitalia that men possess. But then I remember at my wedding, one of my New Yorker editors, Deborah Treisman, came up to me and asked him, "What do you think of Gary's work?" And he said, "Well, the first one was okay."
He's heavily featured on your memoir. So has he read that book yet?
No, he has not read the book.
Okay. Are you apprehensive a bit about it?
Well, I hope he recognizes that it's based on something, that it's the truth, and that maybe it's my truth and he has his own truth, and I would love to hear his truth subsequently and maybe incorporate it into something else that I write. But a lot of this book was, taken almost verbatim in conversations. I took them back to Russia for the first time in 30 years. I go back all the time. They haven't been back in decades. I recorded it on a video. It's all there. I mean, I'm literally transcribing a lot of these conversations. So I'm not making this up. It's just that I think what they say is so based in a culture that no longer really exists, which is the Soviet version of Russia, that they don't quite understand how it sounds to an American audience.
Well, especially if you talk about being big and cucumbers. Yeah.
My father does have a wonderful drunken moment where he tells my fiance that, brandishing a cucumber from his yard, that My son is small, I think, but I am big. Here is something to remember me by. And it sounds so wonderful because I can just see the translation from the Russian.
If I had a father like that, I'd read a memoir.
I'd read a memoir too.
His father is why you have to read the book.
He's wild.
Ayana, your family reaction to your book?
Very.
You've been cursed off to
No,
cast away?
nobody's been angry. I think because
Your mom said it.
my mother specifically, she's very proud and happy, sort of dumbstruck by what's happened, and kind of by the book itself, I think. But yeah, very good reaction, no problem.
I wanted to thank you all for coming today. There was Ayana Mathis, Gary Shteyngart, and Joshua Henkin, and I hope you had plenty of food for thought.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Stuffed. I have a question, a literary question. Can I eat this chicken with my hands at this point?
may.
Or
You may.
really? But is that wrong? Should I use?
No, you can do it.
So, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's so much better.
So much better with fingers, yeah? Finger food.
than talking out of my mouth.
So jealous of Gary's chicken, just for the record.
Yeah,
I
we
just
just
need to
eat
say that.
our farro with our hands.
It's such a lovely chicken. No.